Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of Sociology 3077, Mass Culture and Mass Media, Mass Culture in Mass Society. I'm not sure who came up with that title. It's too long, and the word mass appears 4 times in it for some reason. Nonetheless, this is our first really formal lecture. I think I warned you last week that this lecture is going to be disproportionately long. I expect it to be anyway. We'll see how it pans out. For that reason, we'll see after I finish, I may split it into 2 videos, or I may just leave it and then have a shorter lecture in the future. Perhaps even split it into 2 lectures, not just 2 videos. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to use some slides today, although I typically do not do that. Let's see. Where is it? Forgive me while I set this up. Okay, I think it's working. Okay. So, I have, this week we're going to be focusing on a module that I called the Individual and Mass Society. And it occurred to me, I know that, we're in North Bay, and apparently a lot of people go fishing here. This did not happen intentionally, but I noticed that a lot of the quotations that I'm using this week seem to involve fishing. So I realized this after I was sort of thinking through today's lecture. You'll see I have 2 here. There's at least 1 other quotation that involves fish. I don't know why. I'm not going to read everything that I have on the slides here, but I will share the slides with you on Blackboard. So we're beginning our course with a question concerning the individual, which I think is obviously implicated in the question concerning mass, the word that seems to be repeated, probably for good reason, actually. From a philosophical standpoint, there's probably a good reason that the word mass is endlessly repeated. But I want to be really clear from the beginning of the course that I don't believe the individual, or the word individual, is the best word. When we use the word individual, I feel as though it gives us a preliminary sense of what it is that's at stake, what it is that we're trying to locate. For example, like when I say the word individual, you might think like, I am an individual. You kind of feel like you know what I'm talking about, or you are an individual. But I think this is deceptive, and perhaps even quite naive. So we should take it a little bit slower. We need to cut or section the individual up into pieces to really get at what is at stake in what it is that I'm trying to locate. So the word individual, of course, it means, you can see the root word in individual, it seems to mean that there's an entity or a being without division. Without divisions, that is, without any splits. The individual is not a divided being. Perhaps we sometimes feel ourselves to be individuals that are not split, that are not divided within ourselves. In some sense, we have to presume that just to get on with our daily lives. If I say there are a number of individuals here, you can kind of immediately get a sense of what it is I'm trying to say, and then we can move on. So we might even need that sort of naive understanding of the individual. It definitely makes things easier when we take that approach. But ultimately, it's not a sustainable hypothesis. It's not a sustainable claim. All evidence points to the contrary. We are not individuals. We are, each one of us, divided, split into separate agencies. Agencies means different it's as if there's different wills, different forces operating within each one of us. We know this because we sometimes feel there to be a conflict within ourselves, right? For example, perhaps we feel guilty for something that we said or something that we did to another person. Maybe we feel embarrassed about something that we nonetheless keep doing, perhaps day after day or week after week. It's a repeated behaviors that we're embarrassed about, but we nonetheless keep doing it. You know, we can come up with all kinds of examples to prove our point. And the point is just precisely that we are divided within ourselves. We seem to be at war with ourselves. In these moments, we find a nice demonstration of the fact that we are split against ourselves. I do something, but I also don't wish I was doing that something, perhaps. So at some point in this course, we're going to look at the work of Sigmund Freud. Everybody's kind of heard the name Sigmund Freud by this point, and perhaps everybody thinks they know quite a bit about Sigmund Freud. I would caution you, you probably don't. But today I'm not going to go too far in the direction of talking about Sigmund Freud, except to introduce you to one of his more popular theories, one that I myself would problematize to some extent, but it's important because it can help to orient us on this question of the individual. What is an individual? It's well known that Freud developed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He developed this tripartite, which means three parts, tripartite, conception of the individual, which means that he discovered that there are three agencies, three forces, three wills, if you like, within the human psyche, within each individual human psyche. If you like, each individual has these three agencies. And each of these agencies are in some sort of a complex relationship with the others. They're not exactly, it's not like in the image I have here, you see there's three agencies. You can call them conscious, preconscious, and unconscious if you like. You can call them superego, ego, and id, which is what I'm going to use more frequently than these other designations, which are slightly different. The superego, the ego, and the id, they interact with one another. They're not even, it's so complex that we can't even say that they're distinct agencies. Like you just have an ego, you have a superego, and you have an id. They're interlocking like rings into a chain that form the chain of our being. So we can think of each of these three agencies, superego, ego, and id, as mutually exclusive, yes, to some extent, and therefore independent from the others. But there's also some overlap between the three of these agencies where they intersect with one another. You know, I don't want to go too far in this direction, but let me bring up a whiteboard to show you what I mean. Like if we imagine it like this, this is the superego, maybe this is the ego, and maybe this is the id. You see, they form a kind of chain. They overlap with one another much more than they are like separate from one another like that. Okay. So we gave them their names. I'm sure you're already familiar with these names. You've probably heard them before. Maybe you've taken this in another class. Id, ego, superego. Okay, forget about consciousness, pre or subconscious or unconscious. We're not really going to deal with that today, although, I'd very much like to. Perhaps we'll get to that another point. The human psyche is made of all three, superego, ego, and id, and not just one. So, it's a fairly naive conceptual framework for thinking about the individual and the individual human being divided, being split within itself, an immanent split, a constitutive split, if you like. But it's nonetheless, even though it's a bit naive, it's nonetheless more complex and therefore more useful to use this conceptual model than it is to think simply in terms of the individual where I am just me. I'm not just me. And you're not just you. You're also the various parts within yourself that are in conflict with your understanding of who you are. So let's describe each one of these agencies in just a few words. First, there is the id, which in German just means it, it. This is the most important human agency, the most important element of our psyches, because it's also the most obscure. If you have a hard time understanding what the id is, then it's probably because it eludes understanding. So you get the point. If you're confused by what the id is, you get the point. We don't understand it. It's enigmatic. It's the most mysterious. It's the darkest, most submerged part of the psyche. Indeed, I would say it's monstrous. It is the monster that each one of us has. A monster from the perspective of the other two agencies. It's a monster because we tend not to want to know anything about it. We don't want to admit this part about ourselves. We like to think we are essentially good people, or essentially bad people, or other people are essentially good or bad. The id doesn't fit into this good-bad framework. Okay, that's the language of the superego, as we'll see in a moment. So we don't really tend to like our id. We don't tolerate, but it's nonetheless always following us along. We can't get rid of it. We tend not to see ourselves as our id, or we tend not to see ourselves in our id. The id is, in some sense, animalistic. I'm going to break out so you can see me for a moment. It's a bit animalistic. We tend to run away from it, to avoid it. Nothing we do or say, none of our understandings, our theories, and so on, can tame the id. It pushes us to do crazy things, perhaps, that we can't seem to stop doing. Our pathologies. It means that it's the place of repetition, because we keep doing the same stupid crap over and over again, whatever it is, or maybe it's not stupid, but something that we can't face, but we keep doing. We can't seem to stop these monstrous repetitions within ourselves, nor can we seem to confront them with any degree of courage. The id is a monster in this sense, with irrepressible instincts, drives, and urges. Since we can't control the id, we can't really get an understanding of it. It's enigmatic. Okay, but so that's the id. The ego is different. It's made up of. I'm going to bring up a whiteboard for a moment. The ego is made up of kind of two components. The ideal ego and the ego ideal, which can be quite confusing. It's okay if you mix these two up. I might even mix the two of them up. It doesn't matter which you call what. What matters is that you understand the distinction. If you call ego ideal the definition of ideal ego, totally fine. You know, and if you call ideal ego the definition of ego ideal, totally fine. It's okay if we get a little mixed up here. So we have these two components within the ego. Let's say that the ideal ego is the understanding that we have about ourselves, how we understand ourselves. Maybe I understand myself as a professor. I would be naive in claiming that, but maybe that's how I understand myself. Or maybe I think of myself as a great artist or something. We have an understanding about ourselves. Perhaps it's our identity. The meanings that we bring to bear to navigate our world and to think about ourselves and our place within the world. That's the ideal ego. It's the most important part of the ego. Of course, the ego is a fraud to some extent, but it's a necessary fraud. It's a fraud because we're actually more our id than we are our ego. And yet the ego makes us think that we're individuals, undivided. The ego thinks of itself as a consistent identity or something like that, as if there's no divisions there. On the other hand, the ego ideal is our understanding of ourselves as if from the point of view of other people, how we imagine other people to view us, right? So if the ideal ego is how I imagine myself to be, the ego ideal is how I imagine other people to see me. So it's a bit of a difference, and you can imagine that these two here are probably sometimes at war with one another. Like, you know, I might believe myself to be a good professor, God forbid. But perhaps from the perspective of the ego ideal, I imagine that you think I'm a bad professor. Now my ideal ego is in conflict with the ego ideal. My self-understanding is in conflict with my understanding of how you see me. It's not how you actually see me, but my understanding of how I think you see me, as if you're like a reflection in a mirror that I'm looking at to get a sense of myself. So this conflict, which is demonstrated here by the red arrows, it could be a conflict, and it often is a conflict. You know, I might think to myself to be a genius, but I might imagine that other people see me as an idiot, or vice versa. I might think of myself as a really tough guy. Perhaps I imagine that other people see me as not a tough guy, and this conflict can breed all kinds of toxicity. We might think of ourselves as non-gendered, but perhaps the other sees me as a particular gender. You know, so this is how this sort of stuff can play out. Finally, there is the superego. This is the place of commandments, of authority. It's internalized authority within the psyche. It's a place of rules and grammar and syntax. Even it's a place of morality, and that's important because morality are rules for how to be a good person. So we get our sense from the superego of what is lawful and unlawful, criminal, what's just and unjust, what's moral or ethical, and what's immoral or unethical. It's the seat of authority. Okay, so that gives us our three sort of agencies, and they all intersect with one another. It would be fascinating to go through and show you how these things intersect and link together. But the point isn't to get into a whole bunch of detail about this stuff. It's just to show you the basic point here, which is that we are divided within ourselves. All this other conceptual sophistication is somewhat secondary to that more important point that you understand. So when I do something that shocks me and then perhaps I get embarrassed, there could be a number of agencies involved. Just brainstorming. Like one, the id repeats behavior that's enigmatic and gives me a lot of enjoyment and stimulation. Two, the ego doesn't know how to accommodate that into its sense of self. My monstrous part at the id, at the level of the ego, it's like I can't bring that into my sense of self. And so there's a conflict. At the level of the superego, what happens at the id could seem immoral or unjust. And so we're endlessly perhaps trying to correct it and be a better person. I'm going to be I'm a growth motivated, I have a growth mindset and all this other stuff. You know, whenever you hear the word should, you know it's the superego speaking. You should do that. I should do this. We should cancel those people. That's superego talk. We should. It's should is the domain of morality. The id is not concerned with should. The ego is not concerned with should. So, if you're saying I should not engage in this behavior, you're speaking from your ego, or sorry, your superego. Okay, so we have these agencies all inside of one individual. We can develop it much more. We might do that even in a future class, but that's not our task today. The point is we're not individuals. We're not undivided. We are precisely divided. We are individuals, not individuals. We are individuals. So that's the first concept that we're going to encounter in our readings for this week, which are posted on Blackboard, and I'll get to at the end of the lecture today. The second concept that we will encounter within our readings for this week is mass. I've repeated this word quite a bit. no doubt to draw your attention to the monstrous instinctual energy of the mass, which occurs at times. The word mass, we see that the word comes, it's often portrayed in a negative way. We'll see that in the work of Emma Goldman, for example, in Friedrich Nietzsche, and so on. We're going to see that very clearly in their work. We don't see it so much in Simmel, but we certainly see it there in Friedrich Nietzsche's work. Again, we'll get to that soon, in his concept of the herd, H-E-R-D. But we're going to get to that momentarily. Let's just take a sort of more naive analysis of the concept of mass for now. What is a mass, or what is mass? What does an individual have to do with the mass? We're putting to the side the idea of mass media or mass society for now. We're just going to focus on the word mass. Again, let's not jump to conclusions thinking we understand what the word mass means too quickly. There is the individual and there is the mass, and you could say the individual could be a part of a mass, absolutely. But what is the mass from the standpoint of the individual? Saying nothing about my current spirituality, which has no place here in the classroom, I'm sure. I was nonetheless, when I was born, I was raised Catholic, Christian. And I mentioned that because the word mass seems to carry a certain sense in the Christian tradition. And maybe I'll come back to that in a moment, because I don't think it's entirely coincidental. But maybe the first thing you think of out there when I say the word mass is its use in physics. I imagine if you heard the word mass out in the public, you'd probably, the first thing you'd think of is physics, the scientific study, scientific discipline known as physics. There was an experiment, I'm sure you're all marginally familiar with it, conducted at the end of the 16th century, I think in 1580 something, by Galileo Galilei. You'll probably remember that Galileo supposedly dropped two spheres, two objects. I'm going to pretend they're pens for now because that's all I have near me. Maybe we could say books. But they're different sizes. Okay, two objects of equal sizes, but importantly, different masses, different, to put it simply, different weight. They weighed two different things, but they were the same, two different weight measurements, but they were the same size and dimensions. And he dropped these supposedly from the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy. The reason he did this was to prove Aristotle, a philosopher from antiquity, to prove that Aristotle was wrong in his conclusion that an object of greater mass or weight, naively using them synonymously for our purposes, but Aristotle believed that an object of greater mass will fall faster than an object of lesser mass. So, Galileo wanted to disprove this claim. He supposedly stood at the top of the tower and he dropped these two objects of different masses at the same time. They fell what he found was that they fell at the same acceleration. This was confirmed by the fact that they hit the ground at the same time. So we should keep in mind that they were the same size, they were the same shape, but only different in mass. It's important because you can imagine that, let's say, a flat sheet of paper, like a flat sheet of paper might kind of catch the wind and float or something like that, or maybe a paper airplane would float a little bit. But in any case, we used to believe quite simply that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. And then we didn't. Then we didn't believe it anymore. So there is a scientific association to the concept of mass. I'm butchering the science of it because I'm not a scientist. But the important point, though, I think, is simply that there was this scientific, and still is this scientific concept of mass, and it's a good one. A good one that we can use in our own way sociologically, believe it or not, and you'll see why I say this in a future class. But to give you a little prelude as to why this is important, so that you can understand what is at stake, there's nothing stopping us from being a little bit playful, and I hope you can all learn how to be playful in the right way when you engage in thinking in the university. But we can be a little bit playful and return to something I said earlier when I claimed that, who is it? It's Roman Catholics. Roman Catholics attend Mass. The Roman Catholics attend Mass every Sunday, right? Or thereabouts. The Catholic or Christian concept of Mass, put naively, it's not so far removed from the scientific concept of Mass in physics, believe it or not. I'll have to stretch your brain a little bit to convince you of this, but it's nonetheless true. So why? Well, Mass means simply, if you look it up in the dictionary, it means to come together, to bring things together, to bind them. That's what Mass means in the dictionary. So there's some weight to this concept then, because it pulls you. It pulls people, it pulls objects together to bring them to church. A multiplicity of otherwise disparate elements or people separated are moved in space and time. They're moved from the home or from the workplace to the church in the Roman Catholic version every Sunday. So they're moved in time and space. They stay there at church for roughly an hour every Sunday. So it has a space-time dimension to it. They're literally pulled or moved in space and time. One is pulled to the church, from the home for an hour on Sunday. Okay, it might not be the scientific definition of gravity in the physics sense of the term, but it has the same effect when we're talking about mass. The sociological version of gravity and mass is quite interesting. You'll see next class. But we're going to return to this brain-bending exercise soon. For now, let's return to Galileo and physics. Einstein demonstrated quite some time after Galileo. He demonstrated something spectacular. We're still trying to catch up with Einstein today, of course, so forgive me. I'm not being as scientifically precise as I should be, and I'm certainly at fault for that, but it's because I have a sociological point rather than a point having to do with physics or Catholicism. I'm not a scientist, I'm a sociologist, so I use this stuff towards sociological ends, and I am leading you towards some sociological points here. Einstein demonstrated that mass has everything to do with bodies in space, objects in space, that is, with relationships among disparate or otherwise separate objects in space and time, what we would call in sociology a social bond, a social group, a social collective, society. So, okay, maybe the Earth and the Moon are not individuals, they are bodies, objects, but they nonetheless do seem to have something of a relationship with one another. They're binded in some sort of naive way. There's something like a bond. Einstein's point, of course he had many, but for our purposes, this was his point, was that an object in space having some relative considerable mass warps space-time. It curves it. It means, and I'm understanding it in my own naive way, that objects or bodies in space do not fall, as we might suppose them to, or at least not exactly, but are rather curved in space and time. I know this is, for some of you, becoming a bit too spacey, perhaps. But I'll remind you that it's not all that crazy, because the sun was like a church for a very long time, for a very large number of people. The sun was like a church, and it certainly put bodies into a relationship with one another in space and time, and we called that our solar system. Okay, so it is worth exploring a bit, even if it seems abstract and spacey to some of you, but it is important. The typical way to to introduce this to people is to invite them to imagine two objects and a blanket. The blanket is stretched out. Maybe there's two people holding the blanket. They put one relatively larger object with more mass onto the blanket. And then they put, let's call that the sun, or we can call it the church, whatever you want to call it. And then a smaller object, you put it on the blanket somewhere else, somewhere near it, but not too close. And we'll call that, I don't know, a person or earth. And you put it there, and because of the mass of one object, it curves the blanket, and the small ball goes to mass. It's something like an orbit. Okay, so it's a good preface, whether you're aware of it or not, for what follows with Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian media theorist whose work we're going to focus quite extensively on beginning hopefully next week. Marshall McLuhan's grandson, Andrew McLuhan, is hopefully going to join our class in the coming weeks as well to give a special guest presentation of some sort. And he's much more clear about a lot of these matters. So, you know, I hope you realize Marshall McLuhan is in some way Canada's gift to the world from a media studies perspective. He's an internationally known, he was an internationally known, perhaps the most internationally known Canadian intellectual that we've ever produced. But we'll get to McLuhan next week. McLuhan will connect all of these thoughts together. You know, incidentally, McLuhan was a Roman Catholic, so he will bring us to church, so to speak, since he's discussing mass media. All of this is very simply to say that a mass is a bond of hitherto stray elements, objects, or bodies. A mass is something like an assemblage or a collection or a set of elements. It could be people, it could be objects, whatever they are. Now, having passed through some of the thinking portion having to do with the concept of mass, I'd like to give you the very simple definition of mass from the dictionary. Hopefully now it'll carry a bit more weight than it would have if I would have just given it to you from the very beginning. So as a noun, as a thing, mass is, and I'm quoting the Google dictionary, I don't know if that's the Oxford dictionary or not, a large number of people or objects crowded together. That's a mass. A large number of objects or people crowded together. As a verb, which means an action, it means, quote, to assemble or cause to assemble into a mass or as one body. Body understood not as simply a physical body, but as a consistent entity, an object, like a bottle of water. Okay, moving on. We could say, I mean, if you're really experimental, you could say the ego is him or herself a mass, then, because there are masses of egos. Okay, so we've discussed the individual, we've discussed mass. Now what I want to do is discuss the context within which the three individuals that we are studying for today, namely Georg Simmel, Emma Goldman, and Friedrich Nietzsche, whose works again are listed on Blackboard. I want to discuss the context within which they were writing and speaking. So tuck away these preliminary thoughts that I gave you concerning individuals and masses for now. We'll return to them either later today or in another class. So we might ask ourselves what the individual has to do with the course on mass media. Hopefully we can already hear some of these words resonate in a different way. The word of the concept individual, the word of the concept mass. Media, that's for next week. But our first answer is this one. It's precisely the individual who, during modern times, which we should distinguish from contemporary times, during modern times, the individual is precisely in question during modern times. During the period of modernity, there's a question of the individual and the individual's relation to larger groups, to the mass, to masses of people, and to more to the various complex masses that make up larger complex modern society. You know, modernity begins basically when there are technological advances that are accelerating at a rate that did not occur beforehand. There are new wars and new revolutions. This is the time of political revolution. There's increased urbanization, which means more and more people are moving to the cities for all kinds of reasons, mostly for work. It's the rise of religious secularism. In other words, the fall of religious institutions, the loss of the centrality of churches and religious institutions. More generally, we're talking mostly in the Western context here. These are some of the, we're talking about increased literacy suddenly in the modern period. These are some of the basic signs of modernity. I know some of you are probably wondering when this occurs historically. You want to know what year, between what year. I can imagine the question. I no doubt understand why you would ask a question like that. There are many answers to that question. People situate modernity at different time periods depending upon how they emphasize what is the sort of trademark of modernity or modernism. Some people situate modernity into several discrete periods: an early period of the 17th century, a classical period of the 19th century. Or some people discuss post-modernity, which is more recent, beginning in the roughly 1970s. But this, although it can help to orient you, I wouldn't get too hung up on this, because this is a more of a historical way of discussing modernism rather than a sociological one. Right? Historical or historicism would plot these as time periods and presupposing the way that history moves and these sorts of things. We want to have a more nuanced sociological understanding of modernity, one that's more fit for our discipline, so that it can use its own terms, its own sociological terms for defining what is modern. So, given that, modernity modernity has something to do with the social bond, with new ways of forming social relationships within society. And it has a lot to do with the individual's confrontation with larger groups and with technological advances. And of course, I have listed here as well the changes to the belief systems of social groups, what I'm calling here the death of God, or the birth, the triumph of secularism, and so on. So that opens up some context for the essays that we're starting to read for this week. They're all works of modernism. They're all works within the period that we would refer to as modernity. And they're key works that give rise or give voice to the central problems and questions of modernity. So this gives us context. And I use the word context because that's precisely what's at stake in the question of the individual. What is the context within which the individual is situated, particularly during modernity? The individual is within some sort of an environment, a social environment, context. This word context, environment, and so on, they're all basically homologous. They're synonyms. Another one that you've probably heard in other sociology courses is social structure. I use social structure, environment, context to mean basically the same thing. Social structure is an environment or a context within which the individual navigates his or her or their world. And what is social structure then? What is an environment? What is a context? It's the environment of the individual, yes, but let's take an analogy. We go back to fishing. I'm stealing it from Marshall McLuhan. Consider the fish. I know the fish. I didn't like touching fish when I was younger, even though I would go fishing with my uncle and my friend. sometimes. I didn't like fishing because I didn't like holding the fish or the worm. Something about the fish grossed me out. Maybe some of you are like this, and maybe you're laughing. Some of you are laughing at me right now. I was just a kid, okay? But that's because the fish is slimy. It's difficult to hold on to. It's difficult to grasp. So I'm like a fish. This course is like a fish to some extent, but you're also a fish in your own way. The fish swims in water. Um, I'm not saying anything too profound here, although it sounds like it when I put my hands like this. The fish swims in water. We know that, okay, but does the fish know it? It's not clear that the fish knows that it swims in water. Um, it's a joke, but we should take it absolutely serious. The fish exists within a context, within an environment. And that environment is water, put it simply. I'm using this as an analogy, just like Marshall McLuhan. But the fish depends upon the water. It breathes it in. It can't survive without the water. But the fish cannot exactly easily get outside the water to see the water for itself. He's blind, he, she, or it, whatever gender the fish is, I don't want to impose the gender, is blind to the water. So, okay, if something smells fishy about my claim that we're all fish, it's because we also, like the fish, exist in an environment. Within sociology, we call that environment social structure. We breathe it, metaphorically, whether we know it or not. We're breathing social structure. It sustains us. Whether we know it or not, social structure is the environment within which we live, and it determines us. It gives us life. It's like water in that it was there before us and we were hatched into it to some extent. We're born into the water of social structure. It preceded us. It determines our actions. It sets rules for our lives. But like water, we breathe it in, which means that it goes into our lungs, metaphorically. It goes inside of us in the same way that water goes inside a fish. It began outside of us, but it goes inside of us, right? It's a complication of social structure then, because it's here, like the superego, that the rules that existed out in society become internalized and become a part of us inside. Right? We have rules out there in society. It just so happens that many of those rules out there in society seem to mimic the rules that we set for ourselves in our superego. So, okay, I'm not giving you really anything new here, even though it might seem, sorry, I'm going to go back for a moment. It might seem to a couple of you as if it were a clever or a funny, maybe even not so clever innovation. To the rest of you, it might seem like complete nonsense, but that doesn't make it go away. I'm your environment for the time being. As for our environment, our disciplinary environment, namely sociology, I took these ideas about social structure from the sociologist Emil Durkheim, who I hope you remember, whose name I hope you recognize. And later it was C. Wright Mills, the American sociologist, who, like Durkheim, claimed that we exist within a social structure, and to be a good sociologist is to have the sociological imagination, which is the ability to see within our individual and personal biographies something of wider social significance, which means the fact of social structure, the way in which the individual is implicated in social structure. That's what it means to be a sociologist, to have a sociological imagination, is to see the way in which we ourselves are implicated in a relatively invisible social structure, our social environments, and so on. Mills was really clever because he helped us see that social structure can be grasped. Mills said it, you can get a sense of social structure. We're a little bit more evolved than a fish. Like a fish, we can evolve. we can step outside of the water and look back at the water to understand and reflect upon, upon our prior environment. So C. Wright Mills claimed once again that the sociological imagination is the ability to see our social structure for what it is, to see the way in which we are determined by our social environments, to act in certain ways, to think in certain ways, to have particular desires and rules and moral precepts and so on. And in becoming more aware of that environment, we can also navigate it better. So enough about all of this stuff having to do with context. Let's get to the readings, which I'm going to try to address fairly quickly because of time. I'm going to begin with Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. You should know that in each their own way, Emma Goldman, Georg Simmel, Friedrich Nietzsche, were within this problem of social structure, of modern social structure, modernity, of the individual's relation to the mass, and of the mass to society, and of the individual's relationship to the basic structure of the social bond. So they're all modern thinkers for this reason. You know, Georg Simmel was reading and working through the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. Emma Goldman was doing the same. If I remember correctly, I might have this a little wrong, but if I remember correctly, she was writing notes about Nietzsche on some napkins and then delivering her lectures by looking at the napkins and then ripping them off because it was so dangerous to teach about Nietzsche in the United States at that time. Might have even had something to do with her being kicked out of the United States. But, you know, if any of you are interested in the biography of Emma Goldman, you can go check it out. It's just remarkable. Indeed, the biography of any of these three people. So what did they have to say? Let's take a closer look. I put on Blackboard a short selection from the beginning of Nietzsche's text, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I hope you'll notice when you're reading it that it does read like a novel, a story, a narrative, rather than as an academic text or a philosophical text. Put to the side the fact that we read texts like this, but if you wrote like this in the university, of course, you wouldn't pass because it's not rigorous, it doesn't adopt proper scholarly conventions, but here we are studying it. So yeah, it doesn't read like a philosophical text. It's like sometimes it even reads like a spiritual text. Sometimes it even reads like scripture. It's a philosophical text nonetheless that's given to us in the style of a fiction. In the style of fiction, even within fiction, you know, there are things that appear to us as if they were facts. That's because you'll learn, hopefully, very quickly that truth itself is the structure of a fiction. In any case, the central character is Zarathustra, which in fact is the same name as an ancient Iranian prophet who's at the center of a religion known as Zoroastrianism. Some of you may be familiar with this religion. I spent 2 years working and teaching in India, and I had the privilege of visiting some very old Zoroastrian temples in my work there. It's just incredible. There was one really striking and beautiful one in South Mumbai. I would absolutely encourage any of you to go and visit, and you can visit it if you ever get the opportunity. Let's go through the short passage that I've shared with you on Blackboard. We'll kind of go through it chunk by chunk. There's only a few pieces, so have no fear. The book opens with a discussion of Zarathustra, who, if I remember correctly, having just turned 30 years old, goes out into the mountains, away from his home, spent 10 years out there in solitude. There was, after around those 10 years, there was a sudden spiritual or philosophical or existential, I'm not sure what to call it, some sort of a subjective transformation. in Zarathustra. As a signal or a sign of that moment, as a sign of the transformation, Zarathustra looks to the sun. Sun is a church for a lot of people, church for some scientists as well. But Zarathustra looks up and praises the sun. He announces that it's now his duty to leave his solitude in order to help to transform others, precisely so that the poor can recognize how much wealth they actually have, Zarathustra's claim, and so that the wise will see again how foolish they really are, and perhaps they'll enjoy or make peace with that foolishness. Okay, I actually have no real trouble with these claims, although they're very controversial even today. Who would dream about saying that the poor are wealthy? That could offend a lot of people, but take it as a thought experiment, okay? You might claim, well, this is a great ideology to keep the poor from changing their conditions. If the poor are actually more wealthy than the wealthy, or if the poor are inherently wealthy, then, why should they ever better their circumstances? It seems to be an ideological justification to keep poor people poor and to keep the wise from accumulating knowledge so that they'll stay foolish, and so on. But I really think there's something deeper going on here. This is an anecdote, and again, because it's an anecdote, I might have it a bit wrong. You can fact check me if you like. I believe when Emma Goldman was in Chicago, this was from, I think, her autobiography, Living My Life. She kind of offered a thought experiment. Let's call it a devil's advocate argument. She claimed, if I remember correctly, that if we feed the homeless on the streets of Chicago, yes, they'll survive for another day. And it may be our moral obligation to do so. Yeah, this is only a thought experiment. I'm not saying either way, okay? But in feeding them, is it possible that we also rob them of their soul, of their sense of injustice, that may fuel a desire for them to rise up and rebel, perhaps in revolution, against an unjust system? It's a really tough argument. You might want to play around with those ideas to see what you come up with, but it's a thought. I would not claim that I agree with it. It's not the point if I agree with it or not, but it's a thought experiment for you. Okay, the next part of the text is very important. Zarathustra was in solitude. He had this transformation, and now he seems to be, in Enlightenment terms, awakened. He's woke, spiritually or philosophically woke to some extent. Something like a Buddha figure, perhaps. But then he decides to leave his solitude and join with other people in the world, the individual joining with people, to form a social bond with them in some way. He says, it's a quotation in the book, and I'm going to quote, "Like the sun, I must go down," the sun goes down, "I must go down, as the human beings say, to whom I want to descend." End quote. What does it mean? I must go down like the sun to those to whom I want to descend. I think it means that he sees himself as above the rest of humanity to some extent. But to be truly noble, he needs to get down to their level. I quote again, Zarathustra wants to become human again. It's as if he wasn't human. He was greater than humanity. And now the noble task is to become human. So he calls this going down into the darkness, like the sun goes down, or appears to. We all know the sun doesn't actually go down. But from our naive perspective, the sun goes down. So there seems to be some phases to this movement. Phase one, he seems to go into solitude. He isolates himself from the social bond, from society. Phase two, he transforms. There's some sort of a subjective transformation that elevates him to some extent above humanity. And phase 3, he realizes that because he's so elevated, he has the duty, I don't know if duty is the right word, but the noble task, I guess, is to descend, to go lower to the humans again and not to just elevate above them. Going under, and the reason for doing that is perhaps to imbue new qualities or characteristics into that social bond, to bring something new to the social bond. So, okay, going under therefore means to join the social bond, not to allow oneself to be more than the social bond, but to accept being less than what one is in order to join the social group. It's not a noble thing to join a social group, unless by noble you mean you're willing to give up something of your divinity, of your holier than thou status, of your higher status to descend. Then there's something noble about joining the social group. The remainder of the first part concerns precisely this question of whether one should remain isolated after a subjective transformation, or whether one should join humanity, join society, join a social bond. Zarathustra eventually confronts a saint, and he basically says to the saint, what good is a saint who's alone in the woods? An interesting question, If you've achieved some sort of, even the Buddha, the Buddha, if I remember correctly, after being in a cave, emaciated, he wasn't eating or drinking or anything, and he's like skin and bones. Suddenly, Buddha had an epiphany of sorts, and he said, like, basically, what good am I with enlightenment out here in a cave? And finally, he crawls his way out of the cave. He falls down, and some, if I remember correctly, 3 women approach him with food, and he actually eats it. He lowers himself, Buddha, in this moment. In the same way, I see something similar going on here in Zarathustra, and I wonder if you're seeing it too. What good is a saint who's alone in the woods? You can be as divine and as enlightened as you like, but what good is that in solitude? The saint in the woods remains in solitude, away from humanity for a particular reason, because the saint thinks he doesn't need society or social bond because he has God. He does the work of God, or perhaps he thinks he is a god, I don't know. Zarathustra thinks to himself after he leaves the saint, could it be that the saint does not yet know that God is dead? End quote. This is an enigmatic statement. There's any number of interpretations of it. A lot of people have different versions of what this means. What does it mean, this idea that the saint doesn't know that God is dead? What does it mean that God is dead? How does this relate to sociology, the social bond? Well, let's examine it more logically, very closely. Zarathustra claims that he will, quote, take nothing from the saint. In other words, the saint lives without sacrificing anything, without giving anything up, truly. To join a community, you must give up something. You must sacrifice something. We'll see perhaps in another module that this was Freud's belief in the time of modernity, that you must sacrifice something. So to join a community, you have to give up something. And we'll see that this is a very modern belief, again, when we get to Freud. You must go below, go down, lower yourself to join a social bond, what many people cannot do. And we'll see that Freud believes that that's what causes neurosis, the inability to accept that. But this, for Nietzsche, it seems in my reading, that this is what God's function is. God's function, sociologically, in this text, according to Zarathustra, God's function is to introduce a sacrifice so that the social bond can come together, so that people can join with one another. You must sacrifice. The saint therefore proves that God is dead because he's not willing to sacrifice. God's dead because he can't sacrifice. So there's no God. since for the saint there's no society. God is what authorizes a social bond, therefore. Okay? So let's continue. If at any point you're feeling overwhelmed by the material, the level of abstraction, please take my permission so that you pause the video, go do a little background research on some things if you like, or go back in the video, listen again, or just pause the video, come back to it later, whatever you like. Again, I understand that today's lecture is a little long and perhaps for some of you a little dry. I'll continue though. Zarathustra enters the marketplace next. For our purposes, the place of markets is synonymous with the place of capitalism, which, you know, that's our environment. There's crowds gathered in the market. They wouldn't necessarily say that they are a mass, but they are a multiplicity of people interacting with one another for the purposes of exchange. So it's there in the marketplace that Zarathustra announces to everybody that, I'm quoting him, human beings must be overcome. So we get our first concept here from Nietzsche through Zarathustra of the Overman. The Overman seems to be opposed to the being who goes down, goes beneath, but it's not necessarily true that he is. I need to share my screen again. You know, in the marketplace, I'm going to try and clarify this point. In the marketplace, we can see further proof that there's no God for these people. The Overman is a creature who creates a God to some extent. It's somewhat paradoxical to claim that for Nietzsche. And I know some Nietzscheans would be very upset with me claiming this. We're all entitled to our readings, of course. But the Overman creates a manner of forming a social bond with other people. The marketplace is not a place for a social bond necessarily, although it appears as though there is one there. Zarathustra says, quote, all creatures so far created something beyond themselves, and you would rather go back to being animals than to overcome being human. I'm saying that there's something animalistic about the marketplace. Zarathustra seems to be implying that the marketplace makes us like animals rather than like Zarathustra, who can form a bond with other people. He teaches them not to look to some otherworldly hope as the source of their actions, but rather to look to the earth itself, which is, as you know, a complex and dirty place. The earth is full of rocks, cliffs, mud, water, food, blood, dead carcasses. The earth is not this harmonious place that we like to imagine when we describe nature as this peaceful place. No, it's chaotic and it's filled with blood and food, and animal feces and beautiful flowers, sometimes growing from the feces. And it's no different than the earth is no different than from the soul of man, which Zarathustra claims is in poverty and in filth. You see, here we can see that the earth, our soul, is filthy, monstrous, in poverty. It's like the id, what Freud calls the id to some extent. There's just one more concept that I want to extract from this text, and that's the herd. I have it up on the slide here. What is the herd? Well, Zarathustra aims in this text, or Nietzsche has Zarathustra aim in this text, to steer people away from the herd. You might think that the herd is a bunch of animals who basically follow a leader without question. It's not exactly that. In Christianity, for example, and Nietzsche did find himself opposed to much of Christianity, there's a shepherd analogy in Christianity. It's this analogy of a shepherd who leads the group of sheep. But for Zarathustra, there's also a herd that can exist without a shepherd. This means that the herd is a group of people, group of sheep, analogously, a mass of sorts, which is paradoxically without being connected into some sort of a social bond. They're a group without necessarily a secure bond, really quite paradoxical. It's a group that's not really brought together, but nonetheless exists together. There's no God, no shepherd, but there are people. There's a herd out there in the marketplace, and it's a strange sort of herd. The herd, therefore, is a type of mass, a type of social group that's not led necessarily by a clear organizing principle, such as a shepherd or a god, but rather by its own instincts on the one hand, its own animalistic urges, that is the id. It's a monstrous group. But it's also led by a certain type of morality. And this tends to be foregrounded much more. So it's very important. I don't think I have it written on the slide. Oh, it is collective morality. It's led by a certain type of morality that the herd distinguishes from another more oppressive morality. It sees its morality in opposition to the morality of, let's say, the church or the wider society, the aristocracy, perhaps. So herd morality is always a reaction to an oppressive morality. It's dependent upon the oppressive morality in order to understand itself. So we can say, I'm good because I'm not that other thing that is bad. It must define itself in opposition. And this precisely is the problem of herd morality. It doesn't have a morality for itself, but rather has one that's dependent upon that which it opposes. I am not that. I am not bad. You can ask yourself how much of today's social movements perhaps rely upon a certain type of herd morality. We could debate it. There's all kinds of reasons we could claim it to be true, reasons we could claim it not to be true. Okay, but these are the important concepts and ideas from the text that I wanted to extract. Now what I want to do is move on to a few short things about Emma Goldman's text, and then of course Simmel's, and then I will stop for today's admittedly very long lecture. Apologize again. We should remember something I pointed out earlier. Goldman, the anarchist, Goldman was an anarchist, was a reader of Nietzsche. This got her into a lot of trouble, but in her text, her very short essay posted on Blackboard titled Minorities versus Majorities, she seems to be discussing the herd. She doesn't use the word the herd, but she's nonetheless describing a mass that is a lot like a herd. She writes, I'm going to quote, "The multitude, the mass spirit, dominates everywhere, destroying quality. The multitude, the mass spirit, dominates everywhere, destroying quality." You can see that the herd, the multiple, the mass spirit, the multitude, it's on the side of quantitative life. It's dominating, it's destroying quality. This is something that Georg Simmel discusses a lot in his work, as you'll see momentarily. But the mass is a multitude. It's made up of a lot of elements, a lot of groups, a lot of people. And these people seem to dominate. For Goldman, we see that the environment is linked to this notion of masses, of the herd in the Nietzschean sense. Because all of the system, political and economic, cultural, it's related to a quantitative version of life. So Goldman wants to rescue the domain of quality, qualitative life from quantitative, from the dominance of quantitative life. So we make a distinction then. I don't know if it's worth doing this. Maybe it is. It takes more time, but it might be worth it. Do it like that. So we have quality and we have quantity, and the individual seems to be, for Goldman, on the side of a life of quality, whereas here we have the mass, or the multitude. or what she will call the majority. Over here we have, you'll see soon enough, also what she calls minority. So you have these sort of, I think, somewhat of a naive distinction, but you'll notice that in a lot of modern literature, when there's a question of the individual and a question of the mass or the group, the topic of quality and quantity always seems to come up in this naive bifurcation, this naive dichotomy of quality versus quantity, as if quantity is always smashing the quality of our lives, robbing us of our souls, our spirits, our individuality, and so on. And I'm not necessarily claiming that it's wrong. I'm just highlighting it as a recurring theme in modern theory. Goldman trying to rescue the quality of life being a life that's not counted, that counts, but that's not counted. A life that has texture and depth and richness to it and variability. Goldman writes that quantity has eclipsed a life of quantity, which is advanced by the multitude, the majority. It eclipsed, and it is eclipsing, a life of quality, the life of minorities and individuals. I quote Goldman. Our entire life, production, politics, and education rests on quantity, on numbers. The worker who once took pride in the thoroughness and quality of his or her work has been replaced by brainless, incompetent automatons. Automatons are machines that repeat themselves. I have to sneeze. Oh, excuse me. Can automatons sneeze? Perhaps if they're programmed to. So let's get back to this. The worker who once took pride in the thoroughness and quality of his or her work has been replaced by brainless and competent automatons who turn out enormous quantities of things. You can imagine on a factory production line, endless Coca-Cola bottles, Ford cars, valueless to themselves and generally injurious to the rest of mankind. Thus, quantity, instead of adding to life's comforts and peace, has merely increased man's burden, end quote. So, you know, I have this photo of Emma Goldman here because she really was known to be a fierce speaker. She would just stand in the crowds and start yelling this anarchist propaganda, and people would surround her. For that reason, she was perhaps the most dangerous woman in America at the time. She was thought to be the most dangerous woman in America. We suffer, according to Goldman, from the herd, from the masses, from their fascination with quantity. Goldman goes on to state that individualism, particularly within the United States, within America, where it's valued, is nonetheless simply an empty slogan, propaganda. The ideology of individualism is nothing of the sort. It's actually an ideology of the masses, according to Goldman, and it fuels the herd mentality. It's paradoxical then, I guess, a bit, since the individual is really nonetheless a member of the herd, but doesn't recognize himself or herself or themselves necessarily as an individual within the herd. Goldman seems to want to rescue the category of the individual against this inauthentic figure of American ideology, which is the individual of the herd. So the individual is a part of the mass and has a desire to some extent to be dominated, according to Goldman, or to be repressed. When this happens, there is what Goldman refers to as a compact mass, or a compact majority, a key concept. A compact mass is a mass that's so tightly bonded, so tightly bound together, that it's a question of whether there are any individuals within it. She writes that, quote, "It is absurd to claim that ours is the era of individualism," end quote. The mass is always an annihilator of individualism, according to Goldman. It's compacted. compact means to press together. And I think this is simply her way of describing the herd, because the ideological component of individualism, where it's nothing of the sort, seems to imply a certain moral perspective. So there are individuals who are within the mass, who are the majority, and there are individuals who are in the minority, who, with some degree of courage, will rise up against the masses. So how does this relate to Nietzsche's claim then? Well, first of all, there's no discussion of God as an organizing principle of the social bond in Emma Goldman. Goldman's not necessarily not entirely a sociologist. She's more of a revolutionary, an instigator of political revolutions. If Nietzsche discusses the herd aspect of the mass, on the one hand, then Emma Goldman discusses the way in which this herd makes people feel as though they are individuals, precisely by robbing them of their individuality. I think we know a lot about this. We've been talking a lot about this for many years. I feel like this is kind of something we take for granted today. But in Emma Goldman's time, this was fresh thinking. Simply getting a sticker for the back of your iPhone might make you feel like an individual, but you still have an iPhone. This is something we all kind of say, right? We're not really individuals, but back then it was a really revolutionary thing to say. So you got to kind of put it into context. The Overman for Nietzsche is a bit like the individual within minority groups for Goldman. This is where the transformation, the possibility of a revolution is rendered potential for Goldman. Okay, I'm going to finish up with Georg Simmel. And I apologize again for the very long lecture today. I'm going to try and shorten it by being less verbose next time. Given the time, I can't really go into as much detail as I originally wanted in describing Georg Simmel's essay. Maybe I'll come back to it in another module. I probably will, because I think it's a very, very important text. I think it's much more important than the other two we just discussed, but nonetheless, the other two were important too. The essay begins with a claim. The claim is that for Simmel is that a German sociologist, right, writing around the same time as Goldman and Nietzsche, the most important conflict of modernity for Simmel is the individual's relationship, indeed his or her struggle vis-a-vis society, whereby the individual is attempting to retain some semblance of individuality against modern society, struggling to defend itself from being absorbed by wider society. So I consider this text by Simmel to be a bridge. It seems to bridge the work of Goldman and Nietzsche to what's coming next in our course. I'm going to give you a quick, no-nonsense and dirty version of the text. Basically, I'm just going to pull out the concepts and the theory that's most important for our purposes. So first, Simmel's text proposes the question of how the individual from the rural area, let's say the town, reacts when confronted with the metropolis, that is, the large city, Toronto as our key example. So the individual in the town has, according to Simmel, more of a qualitative social bond, characterized by distances from other people, from other individuals. The individual of the town is more emotional, according to Simmel, or rather their emotions seem to oscillate, vacillate. There are qualitative aspects to the relationship in the town because one relates to another more as a human being. So the marketplace is not really much of a cold quantitative marketplace here. If you need to fix your car in the town, as my dad often does, he'll go to his mechanic, who's usually his friend who has a garage on the side of his house, or not, says, fix my car, the guy fixes his car, and then He says, I can't pay you today. Can I pay you this much later? Or he gives him a bottle of vodka or something like that. So you see, you can compromise, you can negotiate in the town. It's not all vodka and roses, though. There are dangerous aspects about qualitative relationships that we should nonetheless discuss at some point. You know, about when we're talking about emotional volatility, about how everybody kind of knows you, and about the fact that you have to compromise all the time. That can be a hassle sometimes, negotiating things. But the person in the rural area in the town wants to overcome distances, wants to form relationships with others because others are at a distance. You know, just imagine the town. You know, the home is far from another person's home. You have a yard separating the home from the road. There's distances. You have distances between people, ultimately. So you can imagine, you know, in the town, if there's a car crash, suddenly, this really happens a lot, I notice anecdotally in Canada, all of a sudden there's a crowd gathered just around the corner, just watching, because they're longing for some sort of a connection to something. You don't see that in the city, of course. In the town, if I sit at a coffee shop, everybody talks to me. It's not true in a city. The individual enters the city and the attitudes are different. The city and we're talking about the modern city versus the modern town. The city is the place of the market. Everything's objective life, quantitative life, rather than subjective, qualitative life. Transactions are set at a very particular amount, and you can't compromise or negotiate there. It's just business. You fix a car, the price is, I don't know, $300. It's not 301, it's not 250, it's not a bottle of vodka. It's not, I'll pay you tomorrow, right? It's just business. There's a coldness, therefore, according to Simmel, or an apparent coldness to the city dweller. Indeed, the people from the town will often discuss the arrogance of the people from the city. The coldness appears as an arrogance, when in reality it's a defense mechanism on the part of the city dweller. There's a very important reason for this coldness in the city, this lack of emotional volatility. Distance does not exist in the same way in the metropolis. It may be lacking. There may not be a lot of distance in the city. Without distance, we're constantly overwhelmed. We're constantly overwhelmed by our surroundings, by people in our surroundings, objects in our surroundings. So to survive, we must strive to create some distance within ourselves, within our own psyches. We therefore become split or divided as individuals. We create something like a stimulus shield within ourselves. Like, I'll give you a concrete example. If you're walking near the Eaton Center in Toronto, you're going to be bombarded by crowds of people bumping into you while you're walking, smells of all different foods and types, and body odors, perhaps. There's visual stimulations. Everything's competing for your attention. There's advertisements over there, a busker over there, a preacher on a soapbox over there. Maybe somebody fell off his bike over there, and you're just ignoring it. If you're in the town, you'd run over to help, but in the city, you're ignoring it because there's just to survive, you have to bracket out all that stimulation to create some distance within yourself from it. That distance develops into what Simmel called a blasé attitude. Blasé attitude. There's a little example here. Oops, I didn't draw it right. You know, like okay. I'm not sure I put it in the right direction. I might go the other way. I don't know. Blasé attitude, which means kind of like meh, you know, like whatever. It's a sort of attitude of indifference to your surroundings. You need that to avoid sensory overload. Otherwise, there's just too many demands coming at you from all around, too many forms of stimulation, sounds, horns, people shouting, music, smells, different touch things. You're touching doors, you're touching a grate, you're touching a sidewalk with your feet, you're stepping up, you're stepping down, you're walking underneath things into tunnels. It's a sensory overload. So the blasé attitude is a survival mechanism. What you develop is what Simmel calls a stimulus shield. And it's not a real thing, it's a metaphysical thing that you have within yourself to shield you from all the stimulus. It's manifested in a blasé attitude, of course. So in the town, though, you're seeking more stimulation because your life lacks some of that stimulation. So you're out looking for it. In the city, you're out trying to negate it, trying to push away all that stimulation because there's just too much of it. The individual in a crowd, in a mass, therefore, is an individual with excessive stimulations. It's quite different from the individual walking in the countryside who doesn't quite yet have enough, according to Simmel. Stimulation, therefore, will be an important new variable for us in thinking about the individual in masses and society. Because make no mistake, the metropolis is nothing without the stimulations of media, without technology. So to summarize today, we went through a number of concepts. For all the elaborate prose and tangents, there were some substantive things there, which will be used and adapted as we move forward through the course. We discussed the individual as a divided being. We gave Freud as an example with his id, ego, superego notion, but ultimately there's the Overman as an individual in Nietzsche as well. We discussed the mass in terms of the herd, the compact majority. And we discussed stimulus or stimulation through Simmel, which was an added word here, or an added concept. Use some of these concepts as beacons or as flashlights, if you like, to try and feel your way in the dark as we move through some of the courses to get to more contemporary perspectives. Next week, we're going to begin with some of the really fun stuff. It's fun, but it's also much more simple, but also much more mind-bending. It's more mind-bending, but much easier to grasp and much more fun. And that's the work of Marshall McLuhan. We're going to look at the text from Marshall McLuhan at around the time of the lecture. They'll be posted. So I'd like you, like I mentioned in the first lecture, to read them after the lectures or at around the time of the lecture. If any of you has any questions or concerns or comments, please feel free to either put them in the forum or to send them to me by email. I wish you all well, and we will talk again soon.